Welcome to the past unveiled, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We now begin the series with Story 1, The Kingdom of Aksum's Scribes. The scribes' hands were not blistered from war, nor browned by sun in the fields. They were stained darkened by soot and black resin, fingertips marked from hours of ink-making and parchment pressing. In the Aksumite kingdom, where monuments rose to the heavens and coins bore the faces of kings, the real infrastructure of power lay quietly inside stone-built offices and shadowed storage vaults, where scribes turned government into permanence. The boring importance of writing in Aksum. In the 3rd century CE, Aksum stood as a thriving kingdom, a crossroad between Africa, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean world. To many modern minds, it's remembered vaguely for its towering obelisks and its conversion to Christianity under King Ezana. But behind the sweeping drama of royal decrees and faith-driven wars was a tangle of bureaucratic script, tax scrolls, census records, land deeds, religious conversions, and lists of tribute from subordinate rulers. The scribes of Aksum, many of whom were born into the profession, trained for years. A child might be apprenticed at age 7, learning the art of holding a reed pen properly, memorizing the Ge'ez script, the written form of the local Semitic language, and practicing the slow and deliberate act of copying state records without error. A single miswritten mark could transform a land boundary, a trade quota, or the name of a royal relative. Accuracy was everything. Yet this work was slow, repetitive, and intentionally dull. Aksumite kings valued the bureaucratic process as a method of maintaining divine order, and divine order, for all its majesty, was executed through long hours of copying dates, counting livestock, and verifying tax quotas on crumbling parchment that smelled of goat skin. The tools of governance, ink, parchment, and obsession. An Aksumite scribe's desk, if it could be called, that was usually a low wooden board propped near a wall, designed to be used while sitting on a woven mat. Nearby was a small clay pot of ink, which wasn't mass-produced or traded, but made locally by the scribes themselves. Charcoal from burned olive wood was mixed with a resin binder and water, then boiled until it thickened into usable fluid. Some scribes experimented with different soot sources: pine, dung, and even crushed beetles. The results varied wildly. Parchment, on the other hand, came from tanned goat skin. The skin was scraped, stretched, and dried in the sun, often producing imperfections, holes, odd textures, or uneven color. A single tax record could take up 2 weeks of preparation before the actual writing began. Scribes often began their days before sunrise. Cool air made the ink easier to control and the parchment less likely to curl. Breakfast might be a handful of barley or a piece of dried injera bread. Then came the hours of labor, recounting the tributes received from a local district, for instance 10 bags of frankincense, 4 bolts of dyed cotton, 1 silver coin. These would be tallied, signed with the scribe's unique mark, then tied into bundles of other records and stored in clay jars or wall crevices in administrative buildings. Some of these bundles, forgotten over time, would become archaeological treasures. Who were these scribes really? Most scribes were not noble-born. Some were sons of merchants, others former priests or monastics trained in the art of language. They were neither rich nor especially poor, but lived in modest homes near royal or temple complexes. Interestingly, women in Aksum could also be scribes. Though rare, inscriptions mention a handful of female record keepers, especially in religious settings. Their responsibilities were often identical to their male counterparts, recording donations, deaths, and devotional oaths. There was no guild of scribes, no union or badge. Instead, scribes earned their place through reputation. A fast and error-free scribe might be invited to work directly for the royal court, copying treaties or writing sermons for the bishopric. A lazy one could find himself copying repetitive farming decrees in a remote province, endless variations of each ox shall plow no fewer than 3 furrows per sun. This mundane repetition, oddly enough, was where real power lay. Kings ruled with swords and gold, but they governed with paper. How the scribes documented the Aksumite world. To understand the reach of Aksum's bureaucracy, consider this. Scribes maintained detailed inventories of regional harvest yields, rainfall levels, birth and death rates, and even temple attendance. While they did not have the centralized ministries of later empires, their record-keeping system was decentralized and surprisingly effective. Scrolls were often stored in communal libraries, many attached to religious sites. Here, scribes would regularly update dynastic logs, a chronicle of which local ruler paid tribute when and how much. Failure to pay on time was not noted with outrage, but with quiet marks: 1 notch by the name, 2 notches if the failure repeated. After 3 notches, a messenger was dispatched. Bureaucratic warning, Aksumite style. Trade documents were another key feature. As Aksum grew wealthy from Red Sea trade, scribes handled cargo inventories from ports like Adulis. These inventories listed everything from ivory to spices to enslaved people. They were painstaking in detail, with entries such as 2 crates of cinnamon, 1 damaged by rats. It wasn't drama, it was logistics. Scribes also played a religious role. After King Ezana's conversion to Christianity, they were tasked with copying and spreading new liturgies, organizing festivals, and updating temple laws. One surviving record documents a debate on how many days of fasting should occur before a certain feast. The resolution: let it be as in Alexandria, with adjustment for barley cycles. Bureaucracy as legacy. For centuries, the work of these scribes outlived their kings. Emperors rose and fell. Some vanished from memory. But the scrolls endured, stored in dark corners, eaten by insects, lost in floods, but still surfacing in fragments across monasteries and ruins. The real legacy of Aksum wasn't just carved in stone or written in gold. It was written in boring, precise lines across goat skin by men and women whose names we rarely remember. They documented not glory but grain, not war but taxes. And it is precisely because of them that we can piece together Aksum's quiet, ordered past. You sit cross-legged by a fire in the highlands, the parchment scroll tied securely under a wool cloak. The sun is dipping, but the path ahead remains long. You are one of the many nameless messengers of Aksum, a bureaucrat without a desk, tasked not with writing history, but with delivering it. In a kingdom spread across mountains, valleys, and coastal ports, the quiet machinery of governance relied on its messengers just as much as it did on its scribes. If the scribes were the hands of bureaucracy, the messengers were its legs. The terrain and the task. The Aksumite kingdom was not a flat empire. It spanned what is now northern Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, parts of Sudan, and even portions of southern Arabia. Rugged highlands met steep escarpments, and roads, where they existed, were rudimentary paths carved by habit and necessity rather than design. Yet somehow, year after year, scrolls moved from district governors to central administrators. Trade records reached coastal outposts. Tax forms found their way to highland storage halls. The logistics of this were nothing short of remarkable, not for their speed or technology, but for their consistency. Aksum's messengers, though largely invisible in historical narrative, formed the backbone of one of East Africa's most enduring bureaucracies. These messengers weren't military runners or religious pilgrims. They were government workers, underpaid, overworked, and essential. And they were trained not for battle or scholarship, but for stamina. Who were these messengers? Most came from peasant or artisan families, chosen not for nobility but for reliability. A promising young man or woman might be recruited by a local noble or a scribe with too many outgoing scrolls. The training was minimal: how to fold and protect scrolls, how to recite names and destinations, how to recognize local landmarks, and most importantly, how not to lose things. Some messengers specialized in short routes, relaying messages from village to village. Others, especially trusted ones, took longer paths spanning weeks or even months. These long-haul messengers would carry a scroll inside a hollow reed case sealed with wax, along with a tally of small items: wax discs, colored stones, or even knotted cords as proof that the message had not been tampered with. If the seal was broken without the correct tally, the recipient would know the message had been intercepted or altered. There was no guarantee of safety on these journeys. Wild animals, bandits, floods, and even famine posed constant threats. Still, the system persisted. Why? Because the kingdom needed it to. Navigation before maps. In an empire without maps, messengers relied on oral wayfinding, landmark memory, and traditional routes. Some followed caravan paths established by merchants, while others used religious routes taken during pilgrimage festivals or feast days. Along the way, they might stop at shrines or monastic guest houses, many of which offered food and shelter for official travelers. There were also what some scribes called quiet stations, small huts or shelters along key routes where messengers could rest or leave a scroll for another to pick up. These were usually maintained by locals, who received minor tax exemptions in return for their services. A scroll might pass through 3 or 4 hands before reaching its final destination, and each handler would leave a sign and ink mark, a piece of thread, or a thumbprint in charcoal. Despite all this, the system was not flawless. Some records mention missing scrolls, delayed messages, or lost tax ledgers. The consequences ranged from mild reprimands to, in rare cases, beatings. More commonly, though, the punishment for bureaucratic failure was demotion to a less desirable post. Instead of carrying messages about royal grain stores, you might find yourself relaying sanitation reports from mountain latrines. Scroll traffic: what was being sent? You might assume royal decrees and political intrigue dominated these scrolls, but the reality was far more tedious and far more essential. The bulk of traffic included tax collection notices, lists of who owed what, often broken down into categories: grain, livestock, labor, or coin. Population updates, headcounts from villages, including birth and death records. Land dispute resolutions, rulings issued by court scribes about boundary disagreements. Religious calendars, notifications of fasting days, feast weeks, or clerical ordinations. Trade inventory reports, documentation from inland towns about what goods were being sent to port cities. The most sensitive of these scrolls, such as those recording tribute from foreign rulers, were double-wrapped and sealed not only with wax but with tiny woven strings dyed with plant-based pigments. These were tied in precise patterns, and only a few scribes knew how to replicate or untie them. A courier arriving in the capital with such a message would not deliver it directly to the king. Instead, they would hand it over to a gate scribe who recorded the arrival and passed it into a secure archive. From there, another court official, often a high priest or treasury advisor, would read it aloud in the royal council. How long did it take? A typical delivery from a northern district to the Aksumite capital could take 10 days to 2 weeks. Coastal scrolls took longer, sometimes up to 2 months depending on the season. Dry seasons were preferred. During the rains, roads became impassable, and documents sometimes perished in the mud. In rare instances, messengers used parchment lined with tree resin or wrapped the scroll in palm leaf sheaths to protect it from water. The use of animals was rare but not unheard of. Donkeys were sometimes employed, particularly for bulky record shipments. However, most messengers traveled on foot, both for economic reasons and because many routes were too steep or narrow for pack animals. The messenger's mind. We rarely hear their voices, but in the margin notes of some surviving documents, scribes occasionally comment on their messengers. One court scribe wrote, "The man from Shire arrived one day early, though his shoes were worn to dust. He carries no complaint, only hunger." Another scroll, found decades later in a crumbled ruin, bore this annotation at the bottom. This messenger did not know the village names and was confused by the Eastern dialect. Do not send him again for the Western lists. These notes tell us what formal records cannot, that the job was grueling, thankless, and utterly vital. Without these individuals, the intricate scribal bureaucracy would have collapsed under its own weight. There would be no way to compare regional tax totals, adjust trade quotas, or even notify villages of religious holidays. In short, the bureaucracy needed its feet on the ground, and those feet were often blistered, tired, and calloused. Where did the scrolls go? Once a scroll reached its destination, it was copied, usually by another scribe, logged into a register, and filed. Filing methods varied. Some were kept in clay jars sealed with wax, others wrapped in cloth and stored in temple alcoves. The scribes used a form of cataloging, often by regional origin and topic. These primitive archives were remarkably organized, at least by the standards of the time. Some temples even used scroll bells, small metal chimes attached to the lid of the archive room. If someone entered without authorization, the bells would ring. A primitive, bureaucratic alarm system. Over time, as records aged or became irrelevant, they were not destroyed but moved to separate storerooms. These dead archives, as some scribes called them, became cluttered with centuries of goatskin scrolls, some still tied in their original thread. Many of these have never been recovered. They lie buried beneath collapsed structures, eroded hills, and forgotten monasteries. Yet in their dust lies the lifeblood of a government that prized its ink more than its iron. At its height, Aksum was a kingdom of power, prestige, and paper. Its obelisks pierced the sky, its coins crossed continents, and its bureaucracy, silent, detailed, and deliberate, tied the entire system together. But no system, no matter how stable or deeply inked into goatskin parchment, can resist the slow press of time, climate, and change. By the 7th century CE, the once thriving scribal bureaucracy of Aksum began to shift. Fewer scrolls moved across the highlands. Messengers arrived late or not at all. Temples, once humming with the quiet labor of scribes copying ledgers and liturgies, began to fall silent. And yet no cataclysm came. No great fire of records, no dramatic burning of libraries. The bureaucracy faded as it had functioned, quietly, slowly, and with precise forgetfulness. Religious reordering and bureaucratic displacement. One of the major forces reshaping the Aksumite bureaucracy was religious transformation. When Christianity took hold under King Ezana, it did not immediately replace the existing bureaucratic order it merged with it. Scribes, many of them previously affiliated with traditional Aksumite temples, were gradually absorbed into the growing Christian administration. Churches and monasteries became the new centers of record-keeping. Ecclesiastical scribes managed the donation ledgers, baptismal rolls, and fast calendars. Over time, this created a parallel system of bureaucracy, religious rather than royal, sacred rather than civic. By the late 6th century, this church-centered bureaucracy often held more influence over daily life than the royal court. A village might not receive news from the king for months, but would be visited regularly by monastic agents recording everything from alms to absences from Sunday Mass. The ink-stained hands of governance had not disappeared, they had simply changed robes. This shift was subtle. Older scrolls continued to be copied, tribute lists still existed, but their tone changed. Where once a scroll would list grain owed to the king, it might now document grain owed to the bishop. Scribes adapted. Those who were once employed by royal officials found themselves working for abbots and priests. The change was not necessarily unwelcome after all. Food and shelter were more reliably provided in religious institutions. But the nature of the work changed, becoming more moral, more ritualized, and less concerned with trade or tax. External pressures and trade collapse. While the bureaucratic shift to the church altered the internal record-keeping, external pressures compounded the system's fragility. In the 7th century, Aksum's access to the Red Sea trade network began to falter. The rise of Islamic powers along the Arabian Peninsula reoriented major trade routes. Ports like Adulis, once busy with ships and inventory scrolls, began to quiet. With fewer merchants came fewer trade records. With fewer trade records came fewer reasons to dispatch messengers or tally cargo. As commerce declined, so too did state revenue. Without the constant movement of goods, gold, and goats, the need for elaborate tax ledgers and long-distance scroll deliveries diminished. Scribes were not dismissed en masse. There were no dramatic purges, but they found themselves with less work, fewer orders, and often unpaid salaries. Some returned to village life. Others joined religious communities. A few turned their skill to preserving family lineages or recording oral histories for wealthy patrons. But the great engine of bureaucracy that had once defined the Aksumite state was sputtering. Ironically, the more the state faltered, the more paper it produced, at least temporarily. Records of droughts, food shortages, and land disputes increased in frequency. These were desperate attempts by a system trying to document its own disintegration. One haunting entry from a monastery scroll reads, "The rains did not come. The grain was 3 fingers low, no tribute, no road opened. The messenger did not return." Climate and collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests that climate change may have played a significant role in Aksum's decline. Patterns of drought, land exhaustion, and deforestation likely contributed to agricultural collapse in key regions of the kingdom. This wasn't a sudden event. It happened gradually, over decades, just slow enough for bureaucracy to try to keep up and ultimately fail. Tax records became obsolete when farmers abandoned their lands. Census lists stopped being updated when villages disappeared from drought or migration. Water reports, once meticulous, started vanishing from scrolls. Land surveys, once detailed to the cubit, were left half-finished or duplicated across multiple scrolls as scribes lost track of what was accurate and what had changed. The paper trail of collapse is fascinating for its monotony. It doesn't scream of failure at size. A record of unpaid taxes, a scribbled note about missing grain, a broken seal on a shipment scroll, details so boring they felt eternal until they stopped. What happened to the archives? So where did it all go? What happened to the thousands of scrolls, parchments, and reed-bound ledgers? The answer is, most were lost, not through destruction but through disuse and decay. Stone buildings that housed government offices were repurposed or abandoned. Scrolls were either claimed by moisture, eaten by insects, or slowly rotted in sealed jars. Many scribes made efforts to preserve what they could. In monasteries, scrolls were hidden in wall niches or buried under chapel floors. A few of these caches have been recovered, offering invaluable windows into an administrative world that was otherwise forgotten. One such discovery in the Tigray region revealed bundles of scrolls wrapped in leather, tied with red cord, and stacked inside a crumbling clay vessel. The documents were faded, fragile, and written in Ge'ez. Among them were tribute records, temple offerings, and grain quotas from 5 different districts. They were written over 1,400 years ago. They were also unmistakably boring. But it is in this boredom that their power lies. They show not just what was lost, but how it was held together in the first place. The afterlife of the bureaucracy. Though the Aksumite Empire declined, its scribal traditions did not disappear. Instead, They were absorbed into the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and preserved through centuries of monastic tradition. Even today, some monasteries in Ethiopia still use ge'ez for liturgy and maintain handwritten scrolls in ancient formats. Some of these practices, such as writing on goatskin or keeping documents in clay jars, have remained virtually unchanged for over 1,000 years. In that sense, the bureaucracy didn't end. It simply migrated from the palace to the church, from stone halls to mountain monasteries. It went from being a mechanism of imperial control to a vessel of cultural and religious memory. This transformation is one of survival rather than triumph. The grand systems of power that once demanded exact tallies of oxen and grain became the quiet guardians of prayer, tradition, and memory. And through it all the scribes endured. Their ink faded, but their method remained. Final reflection. The scribes of Aksum did not fight in wars, crown kings, or carve their names into obelisks. They copied lists. They folded scrolls. They counted things no one else cared to count, and in doing so, they preserved the structure of an entire civilization. Their legacy is not a monument, it is a method. And in a world that often remembers only the loudest echoes of history, there is something quietly powerful in the scratch of a reed pen, the roll of a scroll, and the patient work of a mind trying to keep order in the face of oblivion. Story 2. Counting cattle and taxing goats. The Agricultural Bureau of the Highlands. There is a dullness in repetition, and in the highland fields of ancient Aksum that repetition was the rhythm of governance. Wake, count the animals, mark the tally, compare it to last month's scroll, question discrepancies, file the new record, eat barley, sleep, repeat. To govern a kingdom as vast and uneven as Aksum, the bureaucracy needed more than kings and scribes. It needed counters, agricultural bureaucrats whose lives were spent walking from homestead to homestead, tallying the most crucial currency of the age: goats, oxen, and cattle. The kingdom's economy rested not only on gold or imported frankincense, but on livestock, and the livestock had to be counted. Why count the herd? In the modern world, we don't often equate governance with goats, but in Aksum, livestock served as taxable assets. Goats could be claimed by the crown or temple. Trade commodities used in barter. Measures of wealth, dowries, inheritance, and status were determined by herd size. Military logistics. Oxen pulled carts, goats fed troops. Sacrificial offerings, needed for temples and religious rites. Thus, understanding how many animals each household owned was critical. But this was not a one-time survey. It was a cycle: weekly, monthly, seasonal, and it required a bureaucratic mechanism built for walking, listening, counting, and recording over and over again. The Agricultural Bureau, not a building but a network. Unlike the central administrative centers in Aksumite cities, the Agricultural Bureau was mostly mobile. Officials, called Kanat in the ge'ez tongue, were assigned regional zones and traveled from farm to farm with scrolls, ropes, and tally sticks. They carried counting ropes, lengths of twine with knots at intervals, each representing one animal. Tally sticks, carved with notches to mark groups of 5 or 10. Scroll, goatskin parchment on which the final tally was inked and dated. Stamps or seals, used to verify official visitations. These cannot worked alone or in pairs. They were often locals, selected for their familiarity with the terrain and the dialects of their district. Their job was not glamorous. It involved trudging through mud, rain, and animal dung. They woke early to catch farmers at their barns, scribbled by lamplight, and sometimes slept in storehouses with the very livestock they counted. And yet, their records formed the foundation for taxation, military provisioning, and ceremonial planning. If a village failed to produce the expected number of goats for a festival or oxen for a trade caravan, it wasn't a spiritual or economic failure, it was usually a bureaucratic one. The counting ritual. Cattle weren't lined up like soldiers. Livestock was often scattered, stabled, or grazing in remote pastures. The counting ritual involved several steps. Oral declaration. The head of the household would state the number and type of livestock. Verification by inspection. The Qanat would visually confirm the animals, counting them as they moved or fed. Tally notation. Knots were added to the rope or notches to the stick. Ink record. The final number was inked onto parchment with the household name, date, and village. Marking compliance. If taxes were owed in kind, e.g., 2 goats per 20, the required animals were marked or selected. In some regions, villagers used colored mud or wool tags to mark which animals were tax-bound: yellow for temple tribute, red for royal levy. The Qanat would note this in their scrolls, creating a layered record: the count, the due, and the fulfillment. Farmers, understandably, sometimes tried to cheat, hiding animals in the hills or delaying the visit. The Qanat were not fools. They often compared notes from the previous season, checked with neighbors, and noted suspicious discrepancies. One marginal note from a recovered scroll reads, "Counted 9 oxen, man claimed 6, 3 hidden behind granary, marked for extra tribute." There were no dramatic punishments for such misreporting, but chronic offenders might be added to watch lists, unofficial mentions in scrolls for future scrutiny. This was the slow, grinding work of governance, repetitive, tedious, and quietly relentless. Scrolls and storage. Where did the data go? After their rounds, the Qanat would return to their regional offices, usually a small room attached to a local temple or noble's estate. Here, scrolls were copied, tallied again, and summarized into district reports. These summaries were either stored in local archives for comparison with future tallies, dispatched to central authorities in the capital via messenger. The records were sorted by village, season, and type of livestock. Scribes would note unusual trends: a village with a sudden drop in oxen, possible disease, or a spike in goats, indicating prosperity or fraud. Some districts developed reputation scores and early bureaucratic profiling system. Villages marked with consistent record-keeping and tax reliability were trusted. Others were marked with marginal symbols: triangles, unstable; circles, uncooperative; or dots, under watch. These systems helped administrators plan everything from religious feasts to trade convoys. If a district was short on oxen, an adjacent region might be required to lend its quota. If a region showed sustained growth, it could be asked for more tribute next year. Livestock as living tax. Perhaps the most tedious but essential aspect of this system was the taxation in kind. Rather than coin, most rural taxation involved livestock. A percentage of goats or cattle was surrendered annually, either delivered to royal granaries, driven to trade centers, or sacrificed at temples. Taxed animals were sometimes branded with ink or hot metal, their ears notched, or their tails tied in colored yarn. A receipt was issued, yes, even in ancient Aksum. These receipts were often small slips of parchment or carved wooden tags that verified that the farmer had given the required animal. One recovered example, carved in Giez, reads, "1 goat black with white mark given to Abba Leal for the harvest season, peace." These receipts could be stored by the family as proof in case of future disputes or second collection attempts. The bureaucracy, for all its dullness, had layers of accountability. Crisis and contingency. When droughts hit, the livestock bureaucracy did not simply collapse, it adapted. Emergency tallies. These were conducted to assess animal mortality. Temporary exemptions. Some villages received waivers if their herds had suffered too much loss. Loan herds. Wealthier estates would lend animals to temples or villages, which would repay them over time, tracked meticulously by scribes. These contingency systems were boring, Yes, but they enabled the state to persist even during ecological hardship. Instead of collapse, the system bent and recalibrated. That's the dull genius of bureaucratic thinking. And while kings were remembered in inscriptions, it was these agricultural records that kept the kingdom running through dry years, locust plagues, and occasional cattle thefts. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. But what happened when people resisted this system, not just through deceit, but through refusal? What did rebellion against bureaucracy look like? And how did the agricultural counters respond when the numbers didn't add up at all? To understand a kingdom's power, don't listen to its declarations. Look at its ledgers. And in the case of Aksum, if the ledgers start lying, something deeper is cracking, something no proclamation can mend. In Section 1, we explored how the agricultural bureaucracy of ancient Ethiopia operated like a slow, steady heart, pumping the vital data of livestock counts through the body of the kingdom. But that heart sometimes skipped a beat. And when it did, the quiet bureaucrats of the fields found themselves entangled not just in counts and quotas, but in resistance. Rebellion in Aksum didn't always come with spears or swords. Sometimes it came in the form of missing goats. The boredom of deceit. It started subtly. A herd of 30 oxen becomes 25 on parchment. A widow claims her cattle died in a flash flood again. A village with 50 goats last season now reports a sudden and mysterious decline, yet the pastures around it are unusually noisy with bleating. This sort of resistance wasn't loud, it was statistical. The Kannat agricultural officials were trained to notice patterns. They might not have used terms like data integrity or systemic reporting inconsistencies, but they had their own internal flags. If a village consistently underreported livestock yet paid its other taxes on time, something wasn't right. If 5 neighboring hamlets suddenly claimed a goat plague, but no carcasses could be found, questions were asked. These subtle rebellions weren't about breaking the kingdom. They were about survival. Villagers feared overtaxation. A growing herd meant higher tribute. Hiding animals was often a practical choice, not a political one. Still, this was rebellion in the language of bureaucracy. Undercounts, false attestations, and noncompliance hidden behind ink. The bureaucratic response. The kingdom's reaction was, as always, boringly methodical. Audits, when inconsistencies were detected, district audits were conducted. New teams of counters would be sent to re-verify livestock numbers, compare them with earlier scrolls, and look for contradictions. Cross-referencing. Kannat were required to compare notes with temple records. Since religious institutions often received livestock for offerings, a mismatch between village tribute and temple receipt was a red flag. Witness interviews. Yes, even in ancient Aksum, interviews occurred. Neighbors were questioned. Older children were asked to list family animals. Gossip, oddly, became bureaucratic evidence. Marking villages. Some communities were flagged in scrolls with symbols indicating habitual misreporting. These marks might result in closer scrutiny the following season. But rarely did it come to arrests or violence. Instead, the kingdom relied on pressure, extended audits, retallies, or even temporary trade restrictions for suspect districts. It was annoying, time-consuming, and it worked. When the system truly broke. Of course, there were moments when deceit escalated into defiance. Historical scroll fragments from the late 6th century suggest entire villages sometimes refused to report at all. These refusals typically occurred during years of drought, famine, or after heavy-handed tribute demands. Some scrolls record towns that simply vanished from the bureaucracy listed in one year, omitted the next. The kingdom labeled such places Dulagabar, a term meaning, roughly, withdrawn from the ink. These were places where scribes were refused, where messengers turned back, and where officials were told, "There is nothing for you here." What did the bureaucracy do? Surprisingly little. In many cases, these villages were simply dropped from the record. Officials prioritized cooperation. If a village resisted too often, it wasn't worth the ink. This wasn't an act of weakness, it was pragmatic. The bureaucracy, like a good river, flowed around obstacles rather than against them. But the records betray the tension. A scroll from the district of Behera contains this terse note. Returned from Hare village, gates closed. Man with staff said we were not welcome, numbers guessed, report incomplete. This wasn't war. This was the cold bureaucracy of soft rebellion. Goats as protest. It's worth pausing here to note that in Aksum, goats were more than animals, they were messages. Withholding goats signaled economic hardship or resistance. Deliberately sickening livestock, feeding them less before an inspection, was a way of manipulating visible value. Offering malformed animals to meet tax quotas was a subtle insult, a refusal dressed as compliance. Some regions became known for creative protest. One village sent a tribute of 12 goats each with shaved fur spelling out "enough." Another, according to one monk's diary, sent a blind ox and claimed it reflected the sight of the kingdom. Scribes didn't find these amusing. The animals were still counted, but the gestures were noted in scroll margins with weary irritation. Bureaucracy, after all, was allergic to creativity. Religious interference and protection. Resistant sometimes found sanctuary in religious institutions. Monasteries were exempt from certain taxes and enjoyed broader autonomy. Villages aligned with monasteries through tithing, loyalty, or shelter could shield themselves from scrutiny. A record from 580 CE recounts an incident where an audit team was turned away from a village near Lake Tana on the grounds that it was under the holy fast. The real reason, scribes noted in a marginalia, was that the village had hidden 40 goats in the chapel. Officials rarely defied monastic orders. The separation between sacred and civic was blurry but respected. Resistance dressed in religious clothing often succeeded, at least temporarily. But the scribes were watching. In another scroll, a footnote adds, "When fast ends, return to check goat truth." The rise of paper power. Interestingly, this era of soft rebellion led to one of Aksum's more creative bureaucratic responses, the triangulated scroll. These scrolls were copies of livestock counts sent to 3 parties: Central Treasury, District Temple, neighboring village scribe. By cross-checking figures among multiple parties, discrepancies were harder to maintain. The idea wasn't enforcement, it was peer pressure. If a neighboring village learned of your inflated loss reports, they might be inspired to file one of their own, or worse, inform on you to gain favor. It was a quiet form of bureaucratic competition. The triangulated scroll didn't eliminate rebellion, but it nudged the system toward greater self-regulation, and that, in the mind of a scribe, was as good as peace. In the end, the system bent, not broke. What's most remarkable is that despite these acts of protest, misreporting, and occasional refusal, the agricultural bureaucracy endured. It adjusted. It tolerated limited deceit. It adapted its routes, records, and rewards. There were no purges of cattle liars, no sweeping crackdowns. Instead, the system operated under a principle modern bureaucracies might envy. If you cannot enforce everything, enforce enough. If you cannot see the whole, triangulate. If you cannot trust the figures, trust the patterns. This was boring governance at its best, unflashy, deeply human, and resilient. By now, we've followed the agricultural bureaucracy of ancient Aksum from its repetitive rituals of livestock counting, through the subtle acts of rebellion that distorted the records. But one question remains: how did the system trust itself? In a world without cameras, digital trails, or third-party audits, the bureaucracy had to rely on its own checks and balances. And that meant someone had to watch the watchers. The men and women tallying goats and counting cattle weren't saints. They were human, capable of error, bias, laziness, or bribery. So the Aksumite state, in its endless obsession with the ordinary, developed a solution: bureaucrats to audit the bureaucrats. Oversight in the highlands, the emergence of shadow counters. In the mid-5th century, a new layer was added to the agricultural system. The Shamakat, loosely translated as verifiers or shadows. These individuals did not count animals themselves. Instead, they followed the Kanat, the original livestock counters, and watched how they worked. The Shamakat operated like inspectors, walking a few days behind the official counters, asking farmers if tallies were accurate, checking for signs of undercounting or worse, fabrication. They rarely announced themselves. Their power came from unpredictability. They carried verification scrolls, listing the previous month's tallies. Interview records, noting what villagers said compared to official counts. Regional summary ledgers, used to identify outlier villages where data looked suspicious. The mere existence of these individuals added a layer of pressure to the system. No one wanted to be flagged for reckless counting, a phrase found in several audit scrolls of the time. Bureaucratic reputation and internal metrics. While kings made speeches and priests gave sermons, it was the Agricultural Bureau that developed an early reputation scoring system, not for farmers, but for its own agents. Each Kanat had a track record. Scrolls evaluated them on 5 criteria. Accuracy: did tallies align with previous seasons and neighboring reports? Timeliness: did they complete their rounds on schedule? Conflict reports: were there disputes or complaints lodged by villagers? Scroll integrity: were their reports messy, altered, or inconsistently stamped? Audit reliability: did their numbers hold up under Shamakat verification? Scores were inked into yearly performance scrolls and stored in district archives. A highly rated counter might receive more territory or the privilege of working in prosperous areas. A poorly rated one could be reassigned to remote or unstable regions, or worse, given to the temple to count sacrificial birds, considered a humiliating demotion. There are recorded cases of counters falsifying their own scrolls only to be exposed by discrepancies during the auditing process. One scribal note from around 510 CE describes such a case. Jeber Meskel reported 112 oxen in Adamurab. On recheck, found 87. Farmer testimony contradicts his claim. Scroll altered, seal partially broken. Jeber to be reassigned. No parchment privileges for 6 months. The punishment was dry, procedural, and absolute. Bribery and the cost of corruption. Where there is bureaucracy, there is always temptation. Farmers sometimes attempted to bribe Kanat with milk, meat, or even wool cloaks in exchange for a favorable count. The state wasn't naive, it knew this happened, so it made bribery bureaucratically unattractive. Kanat who were caught accepting goods not listed on their official inventory scrolls could be summoned for inquiry. In minor cases, they were made to redo the entire season's route. In more serious cases, their scribal records were purged, an administrative death sentence. But more interesting is how the state sometimes codified bribery. In certain border regions or famine-prone districts, counters were allowed to accept food or shelter as long as it was recorded. If the gift was listed on the tally scroll and reported to the district archive, it was seen not as corruption but as livelihood support. This arrangement reveals a crucial truth. The system preferred transparency over perfection. If a counter accepted a wheel of cheese and wrote it down, he was more trustworthy than one who denied ever eating at the farmer's table. The archive as a surveillance system. All records flowed back to regional scribes, and from there to the capital, or at least its central scribal archive. This archive wasn't a single room, but a sprawling network of cubbyholes, jars, and sealed chests, organized by district, season, and asset type. A summary scroll from a single year could contain 47 village livestock tallies, 12 auditor notes, 8 complaints, 3 commendations, 2 bribery declarations, 1 notice of exemption due to drought. These scrolls were stitched together with thread and tied into seasonal bundles. They were not just dead data. They were alive with feedback, often annotated months later when someone discovered a discrepancy or updated a count. In this way, the archive functioned as a slow, bureaucratic surveillance system. It didn't catch everything, but it remembered, and in that memory was power. Temple oversight and divine bookkeeping. A unique check on the state's bureaucracy came not from within, but from religious institutions. Monasteries and temples often kept parallel ledgers, especially for animals donated for sacrifice or food distribution. These records were meant to verify divine obligations, but they served an accidental bureaucratic purpose. When government numbers didn't match temple scrolls, alarms were raised. For example, if a Khanat reported that a village had donated 2 goats, but the temple scroll noted 4, scribes would initiate a scroll reconciliation, a bureaucratic event where both parties were summoned to produce their records and defend their ink. The outcome might be a corrected tally, a note of reprimand, or in some cases, the addition of a new category, disputed herd, referring to animals whose ownership or donation status remained uncertain. These disputes were rarely violent. They played out in offices, in ink, and in silence. They were battles of handwriting and seals. The end of oversight and what survived. By the 7th century, as Aksum's political and economic power declined, the oversight structures weakened. Messengers stopped arriving. Archives were locked and never reopened, and counters simply stopped counting. But in monasteries and remote archives, some of their scrolls endured. One particularly well-preserved bundle found in a dry cave near Lalibela centuries later includes 3 seasons worth of livestock tallies, 2 audit summaries, and a dispute resolution scroll signed by 5 scribes. The scrolls are yellowed, but the ink remains sharp. They are not dramatic. There are no epic battles or royal declarations, just lines of quiet accountability. 12 sheep, 7 goats, 4 oxen, confirmed. No discrepancies, scrolls sealed by Jeber Iyasu. May the ink speak truth. And that, perhaps, is the true legacy of Aksumite bureaucracy. Final reflection. Power in Aksum wasn't only about kings and monuments. It lived in the systems people built to count each other's goats, verify their honesty, and trust that the ink would speak louder than memory. The Agricultural Bureau of the Highlands was never meant to inspire poetry, but in its caution, its cycles, and its resilience, it revealed a civilization committed not to spectacle, but to stability, a rare and fragile thing in history. In a kingdom of trade and tribute, where scrolls were inked with tallies of grain, livestock, and incense, there was one element whose bureaucracy was both invisible and absolute: water. Not rivers, not lakes, but water in its most elusive form: seasonal rain, hidden springs, underground cisterns. The Aksumite kingdom, vast and mountainous, learned early that prosperity was seasonal, and that governance began with managing what could not be seen. And so emerged a quiet, uncelebrated layer of the ancient Ethiopian bureaucracy, the hydrological scribes. These men, and occasionally women, kept the records of rainfall, canal repairs, irrigation allotments, and even village thirst disputes. If the scribes of cattle dealt in wealth, these scribes dealt in survival. Why water deserved bureaucracy. The Aksumite highlands were fertile, but only conditionally so. The kingdom depended on the Meher rains, the long rainy season from June to September, and the Belg rains, shorter, less predictable showers in spring. These dictated not only the planting and harvest, but the very capacity of the land to support its population. When the rains failed, and they often did, the economy faltered. Livestock weakened, crops died, and trade slowed. And yet people survived, not because of natural abundance, but because Aksum had systems, quiet, boring, deliberate systems to manage water in all its elusive forms. The water clerks of the highlands. Officially, these figures were known as Metkin, literally, measurers of water. Their role straddled civil and religious spheres. They were not engineers nor mere laborers. They were observers, tallymen, and recorders. Each was assigned a region, typically aligned with a valley or farming corridor. Their responsibilities included recording rainfall with simple clay gauges and seasonal scrolls, measuring spring flow and tracking when it began and ended, supervising the clearing of canals and knotting silt levels, scheduling irrigation rotations between villages, reporting anomalies such as dried wells or early flooding. They walked slowly, observed everything, and wrote constantly. One fragment from a Metkin scroll, dated approximately to the early 6th century, reads, "The flow at Mariam Spring is 1 finger below last meher. Farmer Tesfaye says the cattle hesitate. First irrigation was 7 days early. Adjust canal gate." It's not poetry, it's survival. Water storage, underground engineering without fame. Though the kingdom is known for its towering obelisks and church-cut rock architecture, some of its most vital infrastructure lay beneath the surface. Cisterns, basins, and reservoirs. These were not grand aqueducts like in Rome. They were practical, boring pits, carved into stone, sealed with resin, and covered with stones or thatch to minimize evaporation. The Metkin, along with village elders and priests, kept cistern log scrolls that recorded when the cistern was last filled, how many households it served, when it was last cleaned to avoid contamination, how much water was left at the peak of dry season. Most cisterns served about 15-20 families and were considered sacred. Children were not allowed to play near them. Some were even guarded during drought years, not by soldiers but by scribes with scrolls who checked the usage quotas. The system of rotational irrigation. In valley regions with flowing water sources, a rotational irrigation system was enforced. Villages took turns directing water into their fields, using primitive but effective wooden gates. A Metkin, with a scroll in hand, would oversee this schedule. Each village had a rotation day, e.g., every 5th day, a gatekeeper appointed annually, a tally scroll that tracked misturns or water overuse. Failure to follow this schedule resulted in reassignment to the end of the cycle, a bureaucratic punishment that could doom a harvest. Disputes were not uncommon. Villagers sometimes bribed gatekeepers or lied about drought damage. The Metkin's job was to record, mediate, and quietly enforce. There are no records of violence, but many notes like this. Yaird's field took water twice in 5 days. Tally scroll adjusted. Next rotation denied. Approval needed from district priest. Bureaucracy was the dam. What happened during drought years? Drought was not a surprise, it was a known pattern, and the bureaucratic system adapted accordingly. During known or anticipated drought periods, Metkin scribes issued scarcity scrolls, which adjusted irrigation rotation to longer intervals, introduced village quotas for livestock watering, directed grain to be planted closer to surviving water sources. These scrolls were not permanent laws, but seasonal decrees, sealed with local priest or noble marks. In some cases, temporary water courts were convened gatherings of scribes, elders, and landholders to determine emergency policies. One scroll fragment preserved in a monastery near Adua recounts such a decision. The spring at Dega will serve only cooking use, washing prohibited, livestock to drink at night, no water for flax soaking. Penalty, 2 days of labor. It's dry reading, intentionally so. The boredom was the point emergency without panic. Religious influence and superstition. Water scarcity was also spiritual. Temples held blessing ceremonies for springs. Priests performed rituals when rains were delayed. But behind the incense and prayers, the temple scribes kept their own water logs parallel to those of the civil Metkin. Sometimes the two bureaucracies clashed. If the church allowed more water to a monastery field, the civil scribes would record the deviation. These disputes were rarely resolved in open court. Instead, scrolls were copied, compared, and quietly negotiated. An unusual case recorded in a 7th century scroll describes: the priest watered the lentils during the fast. Farmer Howie protested. Scrolls show breach. Monastery offered grain in apology. Gate restored. Here, bureaucracy didn't overpower belief. It adapted to it. Children and water education. The system endured because it was taught early. Young boys, sometimes girls, too, were trained to read cistern levels, clean clay gauges, and assist Metkin officials. These apprentices learned to read rain signs, the angle of mist, the color of clouds, the timing of dew. This wasn't mystical. It was institutionalized peasant science, recorded in margin notes and scrolls that never left the village. Some of the surviving scrolls from these apprentices are the most touching. Today the canal was too dry to fish frogs. The water elder says this means Belg will be short. I will clean the basin. These weren't just children. They were bureaucrats in training. Final thought. Water shaped everything in Aksum: agriculture, trade, religious festivals, even marriage seasons. And yet, its governance left behind no monuments, only scrolls filled with scribbles about flow rates and cistern depths. These records tell us that the greatest tool in Aksumite survival wasn't strength or faith. It was organization. But what happened when these systems failed? When the cisterns cracked, the springs ran dry, and the scrolls began to contradict the skis. It always began the same way, not with parched mouths, but with silent measurements. A Metkin checked his clay gauge after the Meher rain should have started and found it dry. He checked again. Still dry. A few light mists, some false puddles. Then nothing. The hydrological scrolls, neatly compiled and stored, didn't scream. They whispered, "This is not normal." The ink turned more urgent, the margins more crowded. The scribes began to copy each other's reports, trying to determine if the lack of rain was regional or kingdom-wide. A drought in Aksum did not come as a surprise. But when it did come, it tested the quiet infrastructure built on scrolls, knots, and schedules, and revealed how long a civilization could function on discipline alone. Detecting the drought. The first line of defense was not divine ritual. It was pattern analysis. Each district water scroll included columns for rainfall, stream depth, and spring delay. When those columns remained blank or the numbers dipped below historic levels, kept in older scrolls in the village temple, a note would be sent to the provincial archive, a central repository for comparing water conditions across the region. Scribes would then tally: number of dry cisterns, number of missed irrigation rotations, number of water disputes filed. If thresholds were met, usually 3 signs within 2 consecutive weeks, a formal drought protocol was declared. It wasn't a law, but a bureaucratic status akin to an internal state of emergency. A decree might read: let the water be rationed by third-hand scrolls, no new plantings, cattle rotations halved, only 2 pots per home, signed by the district ink holder and temple keeper. Nothing dramatic, just orders on a scroll, but these scrolls moved faster than clouds. Emergency measures, administrative survival. Once a drought status was active, several measures kicked in automatically, if not formally enforced. 1 scroll lockdowns. Non-essential irrigation records were suspended. Scribes focused only on existing water sources. New canal projects or maintenance logs were halted. Every scroll written had to be approved by both a senior Metkin and a local priest. 2. Resource triage. Cisterns were audited and classified by tier. Tier 1, drinking only, sealed with resin caps. Tier 2, cooking and livestock, allowed at dawn and dusk. Tier 3, emergency reserve, guarded, rarely opened. Access was documented via tally tags, small wooden chips marked with household identifiers. Each family received a set number. No tag, no water. These were tracked in ledgers and adjusted weekly. 3. Labor reassignment. Men and older boys were conscripted not to fight, but to dig temporary water trenches or clear old channels. Women, particularly those trained in record-keeping or who served as herbalists, were asked to identify water-retaining plants, roots, or moss-bearing stones that indicated underground moisture. All of this was tracked. Every trench dug, every tag issued, every disputed turn at the cistern was written down, creating a kind of paperwork flood in the middle of a hydrological famine. Scroll disputes, when data becomes dangerous. In normal times, disagreements over water were dull, a mistaken rotation, a forgotten tag. But during droughts, data became ammunition. One archived scroll describes a dispute between two villages sharing a spring. The first claimed early rotation due to ancestral right. The second produced a tally scroll from 11 years prior, showing reversed turns. A third village, downriver, entered the argument with cistern logs that proved the first village had drawn more than its share over 5 consecutive days. The result, not war, a 5-day tribunal of scroll comparison. One scribe, perhaps exhausted, wrote in the margin, "I would rather drink ink than read one more spring log." In the end, the spring was divided by hour, morning for one village, afternoon for the other. A third party was given observer rights, all logged. Water wasn't free, it was bureaucratically sliced. Religious responses, bureaucratic echoes. Temples responded with fasting, prayer, and public rain petitions. But behind every sacred procession stood clerical scribes, tallying. Number of days since last rainfall. Number of animals sacrificed. Number of villagers attending rituals. These figures were not kept for theological reasons, but to measure desperation. A sudden increase in temple visits was a signal. The people were frightened. A corresponding note might be sent to provincial scribes, triggering another audit of water stores. In a fusion of faith and governance, some monasteries even began issuing water dispensation scrolls, official documents signed by both abbot and Metkin, allowing certain families to draw extra water in exchange for temple labor or donations. These became currency, traded quietly and sometimes forged. The role of the messenger in drought years. You might assume messengers would stop moving when drought struck, but in fact the opposite was true. Scroll traffic increased, sometimes doubling. Messages had to be hand-delivered between district scribes, temples, and noble estates. Updates on rain, spring flow, and well failure traveled by foot across dozens of miles. To accommodate this, messengers were sometimes granted water tokens, metal discs, or cloth patches, giving them drinking rights at any cistern, regardless of affiliation. These were guarded jealously and recorded in messenger logs. And still, some never returned. A marginal note in a temple archive records. The boy sent to Edwa with drought scroll did not arrive. Path too dry. His patch was found under stone. Even in bureaucracy, tragedy found a line. Cultural memory and scroll legacy. After the rains returned, if they returned, scrolls from the drought year were bundled separately and marked with a symbol, usually a half circle or 3 dots. These became known as scar scrolls, not meant for use, but for warning. When a scribe began a new season's rainfall log, he might start by reading the scar scrolls, to remind himself what had failed before. This wasn't superstition, it was procedural memory. Some of these bundles were kept in clay jars and buried under temples. Others were left in cistern vaults, to be discovered later if the drought came again. And in at least one recorded case, a scar scroll was copied into a teaching manual for Meccan apprentices, with a note at the top. Do not trust skis, trust tallies. The water lies, the ink remembers. Aksum had survived before. It had endured seasonal droughts, crop failures, and even regional rebellions. Its bureaucracy, slow-moving, scroll-bound, and repetitive, had proven resilient time and time again. But as the 7th century approached, the cracks deepened. And while the temples still rang bells for rain and Meccan may still inked rainfall tallies, something fundamental had changed. The scrolls began to contradict reality. No longer a temporary delay of water, this was a prolonged failure. 3 years of weak meher rains, 2 Belg seasons without a drop, streams dried into dust, basins stayed empty. The cistern logs were full but of despair, not water. This is the story of when the system, boring and beautiful, finally broke. The drought that wouldn't end. The signs were everywhere, and yet the scrolls kept being written. Perhaps it was duty, perhaps it was denial. The Meccan may continued their rounds, often with nothing to record. One particularly haunting scroll, found in a cave near Axum, reads, 3rd Belg gauge dry, no mist, no insects. Farmer Jebrameskel stares at the dirt, he says nothing now. He offered no tea. The clerks still inked their reports, still held meetings, still drafted rotation schedules, even when there was no water to rotate. The bureaucratic machine functioned even in futility, a system of discipline, unable to admit its own powerlessness. But beneath the surface, belief in the system began to wither. Abandonment and apathy. By the 4th year of dryness in some districts, field scribes stopped reporting. Cistern logs were no longer updated. Rotational rosters were left blank. Villages once ranked for their record-keeping were now ghost settlements, either emptied or unwilling to participate in a system that no longer protected them. Scrolls returned to district centers, unfolded an unspoken sign that no one had read them. In some cases, messages were intercepted with polite marginalia. We have no more ink. We do not count what we cannot drink. The infrastructure didn't collapse in flames or revolution. It simply became irrelevant. The scribes kept writing, but the people stopped reading. The temple's last role. When the civil Meccan May could no longer enforce irrigation schedules or maintain compliance, the temple network stepped in, not with better data, but with ritual cohesion. Ceremonies became more frequent, more desperate. Entire villages marched to sacred springs, praying not just for rain but for reason, a sign that the drought had meaning or would end. Offerings increased. Goats, grains, even scrolls themselves were burned in symbolic sacrifice. Temple scribes recorded this shift with meticulous care. On the 12th of Nahas, the villagers burned the rotation scrolls, said they were cursed. I asked to save the ink bottle, they let me. I have it now. The priests began to manage remaining water stores not with math but with hierarchy. Senior monks drank first, initiates last. Women and children were assigned days. Compliance was enforced not through tags or ledgers but through fear of divine judgment. This wasn't a return to chaos. It was a spiritual bureaucracy rising from the ruins of a rational one. Scrolls as memory, not instruction. In the final decades of Aksum's great bureaucratic age, the purpose of the water scrolls shifted. They were no longer active documents. They became passive records, artifacts of a time when order still meant survival. They were copied, bundled, and sealed not to guide, but to warn. Some scrolls were hidden inside temple walls. Others were buried under dry cisterns in clay jars, marked with small carvings, waves crossed with lines, or half-suns above empty bowls. A few were placed alongside icons, as if the memory of failed measurement could be sanctified. It's here that the Aksumite state showed its greatest strength, not in preventing collapse, but in preserving the evidence of it. Even as the fields cracked and the springs receded, the scribes ensured the next generation would remember the mistake. A memory of when even perfect scrolls could not bring water. One last archive. In 1906, an archaeological expedition in northern Ethiopia uncovered a sealed stone vault beneath what had once been a monastery. Inside were dozens of scrolls, water tallies, rainfall reports, cistern rosters, all dated to the early 600s CE. They had been sealed deliberately, not by catastrophe, but by resignation. Each scroll was wrapped in goat hide, stitched with care. Some included ink pots dried, capped, and placed as if to say, "This is where the counting ends." One of the final entries in the bundle reads, "The rain does not return. The people look to the priests. I still measure. I have nothing to record. I have sealed this scroll in trust. If you find it, know we tried." The scroll was unsigned. Reflection: the system that survived itself. The Aksumite water bureaucracy did not fall in battle. It died in silence, not from incompetence but from irrelevance. It had done its job, delayed collapse, bought time, but in the end it could not command the clouds. And yet its legacy remains. The scrolls still exist, dry and cracked but legible. The cisterns, long emptied, still mark the earth. The systems that failed still inform us, like warning lights on ancient dashboards. That's the beauty of boring history. It outlasts the storms, even the ones that never come. Story 4. Royal messengers of Ethiopia walking across an empire with paper. The empire stretched farther than the eye could see, but no one rode horses. No one sent pigeons. The kingdom's heartbeat was carried by feet blistered, worn, and deliberate. Across mountains, deserts, and mist-shrouded highlands, the royal messengers of ancient Ethiopia walked. They carried no weapons. They rode no carts. What they bore instead were scrolls inked with taxes, decrees, lists, and letters. And so the empire functioned, not because it shouted, but because it walked. These messengers were not remembered in the same way kings or priests were. Their names were rarely recorded. But without them, no temple would know the feast day, no governor would know the harvest quotas, and no scribe would know who lived or died. In the end, Aksum was not ruled by crowns. It was ruled by paper delivered by human legs. The role of the messenger. Called Zuitari in Giez, the royal messengers were state employees, though they had no desks or offices. They were selected from loyal village families, trained in route memory and scroll protection, and dispatched on foot with official seals, wax tokens, and occasionally passwords or oral confirmations. Their tasks included delivering tax records from provinces to the capital, carrying ritual calendars between temples, transmitting land decrees to distant noble households, transporting drought reports, conflict resolutions, and inheritance scrolls, returning with acknowledgments of receipt, signed and sealed. And sometimes they carried messages simply saying, "The king will not visit this year." The task was not to inspire, it was to inform. The tools they carried. A messenger's pack was humble but efficient. Scroll cylinder, a hollow reed or wooden tube sealed at both ends with wax, containing one or several folded scrolls. These were often lined with tree resin to resist moisture. Ink and parchment scrap, used for emergency notes, signed on the spot if needed. Seal tokens, small discs made of wax or clay, each imprinted with a symbol, the district, the office of origin, and the type of document inside. Ration pouch, barley bread, dried meat, and salt. Water was sourced en route, either from rivers or pre-established cisterns. Badge of passage, a stitched mark on the outer cloak, identifying the wearer as a government courier. These were respected, though not always obeyed. No weapons, no guards, just paper and trust. The road system, that wasn't a road system. The Aksumite kingdom had no formal roads in the Roman sense. There were no paved highways or stone markers, but the messengers followed living maps, footpaths used by herders, pilgrimage trails, and trade corridors. Each route was memorized, not just in distance but in timing. From Adua to Lalibela, 6 days assuming no rain. From the Red Sea port of Adulis to the capital, 15 days if dry, 22 if the rains had softened the mountain trails. Waypoints included shrines where they could find shelter, monastic guest houses where food might be offered in exchange for blessings or news, well stations marked by stone cairns where fresh water could be drawn, and everywhere scrolls moved silently, on backs bent beneath the sun. Scroll security, how paper was protected. A scroll could not be allowed to fail, so the bureaucracy devised systems of integrity. One seal matching. Each scroll was closed with a wax seal bearing an official mark. Upon arrival, the recipient compared the seal against a tally stick or seal ledger. If it matched, the scroll was genuine. If broken or mismatched, suspicion followed. 2 message tags. Some scrolls were tagged with colored threads. Red for royal tax, white for temple ritual, blue for emergency, green for property disputes. This allowed readers to prioritize without opening them. 3 witness scrolls. For sensitive deliveries, messengers carried a second, smaller scroll with basic metadata: sender, date, intended recipient. Upon delivery, this was signed or marked with charcoal thumbprint by the receiver and returned with the courier, proving the delivery had been made. It was bureaucracy watching itself. Life on the road. Messengers were under no illusions of grandeur. The work was hard. They walked up to 20 kilometers a day through mud, wind, and blistering heat. Their companions were goats, traders, and dust. They traveled light. They washed infrequently. Some developed rituals touching certain trees or stones for luck before crossing rivers or climbing ridges. Yet they were vital. Scribes recorded their arrival and departure times. Delay beyond 3 days meant a field report. Delay beyond 5 without explanation triggered an investigation. A lost scroll was not a scandal, it was a failure of the state. But in truth, messengers rarely failed. They were conditioned not just to walk but to endure. A messenger's memory. Though rarely written, oral records suggest messengers trained to remember. Names of all village elders on their route. Landmarks by season: a waterfall in spring, a dry hill in summer. Scroll weight. Some could guess the type of document by weight and balance. There is one tale, passed down in a monastery's scribal diary, of a messenger who was ambushed on a remote trail. Rather than lose the scroll, he ate the tag, hid the scroll under a stone, and ran toward a monastery. He returned later, retrieved the scroll, and completed his delivery 6 days late. He was not punished. The marginal note simply read, "Scroll returned, late whole, good man." No medals, just acknowledgement. What the scrolls carried. While most of the documents were mundane taxes, rotations, food stores, some carried emotion. Death notices, telling distant families of a relative's passing. Inheritance verdicts, shifting goats or grain between siblings. Exile orders, sending a man to another province for 10 years. There are even rare records of apology scrolls, personal messages between feuding nobles or clergy, asking forgiveness through formal language. These were sealed twice, so no one could read them on the road. The messenger often didn't know what he carried, but sometimes he did. And sometimes, even when the journey was long and the roads dangerous, the scroll arrived with this note. Delivered with urgency, no mark of rain, foot bleeding, still arrived. Every scroll arrived because someone walked. Every walk was planned because someone watched. Behind every messenger of Aksum was a quiet network not of towers or trumpets, but of scrolls, seals, and schedule ledgers that mapped not just the empire, but its rhythms. The delivery of royal and administrative messages was not left to chance. While the Zeutery, the royal messengers, walked the trails, a second class of officials, the coordinators, known in Giez as messaged late or order minders, ensured the system functioned, even if slowly. In a world without clocks, phones, or printed maps, the Aksumite state had developed a living bureaucracy of motion, one that turned information into movement, and movement into governance. Who trained the messengers? Contrary to legend, messengers were not picked at random, nor were they self-taught. The messaged late ran training circuits, usually based out of major administrative centers like Aksum, Yeha, or Matara. Trainees, usually boys from trusted farming families or junior monastics, were selected for. Endurance, could they walk all day with a full scroll case? Memory, could they recite a village list without error? Discretion, could they carry messages without speaking of them? Training involved route memorization, seal identification, and even weather reading. One exercise required trainees to walk between two villages with a sealed scroll, deliver it silently, and return with the signature token, all without asking for help. If they succeeded 3 times, they were inducted. How routes were assigned. Messengers didn't choose their own paths. Their routes were scheduled quarterly by the messaged late, who used a system of scroll calendars to assign delivery circuits. These calendars included distance grids based on season, shorter routes in rainy months. Risk scores, indicating which roads had recent bandit activity or floods. Scroll load levels, to avoid burdening one messenger with multiple high-volume routes. Each messenger was issued a route scroll, inked with departure and arrival dates, checkpoints, expected scroll type, and backup plans. A sample line from a recovered route scroll. Zeutery Gabru route, Agilis Aksum right arrow enderta. Total days, 18. Scrolls, 2 blue, 1 green. Confirm cistern at Farima. Avoid path near Abuna Ridge locust report. Return via Shrine Trail. Signature required at Aksum East Gate. Nothing romantic, pure planning. Checkpoints and message validation. The Aksumite system lacked formal post offices, but it did have checkpoints, usually shrines, monasteries, or noble estates with scribal offices. At each checkpoint, messengers did the following. Show badge of passage, a colored thread or stitched patch with their district symbol. Present route scroll, matched against local checkpoint records. Submit verification tag, typically a wax seal or inked thumb mark. Refill supplies if permitted. All of this was logged in checkpoint scrolls, which were sent quarterly to district archives. These created a shadow map of messenger movement, not for public use, but for internal audit. Some routes had as many as 4 validation points, depending on the sensitivity of the scroll. Dealing with delay and disruption. When a messenger did not arrive on time, the messaged late had protocols. 1. 3-day delay. A messenger's home archive was notified. No action taken unless scroll type was urgent, blue or red tagged. 2. 5-day delay. A parallel messenger was dispatched with a duplicate scroll, if one existed, or a placeholder message. 3. 7-day delay. A record of loss was inked and submitted to the scribal center. Investigators began questioning checkpoint scribes along the route. Most messengers made it, but when they didn't, their names entered the black scroll, a sealed ledger kept in Aksum's Eastern Archive. One entry reads, Zeutery Hawariat, son of Lemma, dispatched on 8th of Tekimt, did not return. Blue tag scroll, no checkpoint validation, marked with silence. The term marked with silence signified presumed lost in duty, a phrase both respectful and final. Who watched the message late? Even the coordinators were not above scrutiny. Their quarterly scroll calendars were reviewed by scribal reviewers, a separate bureaucratic layer appointed by the Central Archive. These reviewers checked messenger workloads, ensuring no person was overused. Route repetition to avoid predictability, important in unstable areas. Delay ratios, the percentage of scrolls arriving late from each route manager. Those with poor scores were not dismissed, just reassigned to land records or granary duties. A quiet bureaucratic exile. Scroll hierarchy and priority. Not all messages were equal. The messaged late developed a system of scroll classes, indicated by the color of thread tied to the scroll tube or sealed tag. White thread, religious and liturgical scrolls, feast day calendars, ordinations. Red thread, tax and trade-related messages. Blue thread, emergency or military communications, famine reports, border skirmishes. Green thread, land disputes, inheritance rulings. No thread, routine correspondence. Scrolls with blue threads were moved with urgency. Special messengers were trained in night travel, and cisterns were pre-notified to expect them. These messengers could invoke Axum's right of water, overriding local rationing rules. If they arrived late, their route logs were studied not to punish them, but to improve the system. The goal was not perfection, the goal was persistence. Data retention and route memory. Every quarter, the route scrolls and checkpoint logs were compiled into movement reports, scroll bundles summarizing messenger traffic. Number of scrolls sent. Number delayed or lost. Average route time. Notes from messengers, if recorded. These were stored in the second archive hall of Aksum, stacked seasonally. Some bundles survive not for their content, but for their sheer volume of motion. One movement report from a year without famine or war recorded. 367 scrolls dispatched. 41 returned. 9 lost. 2 messengers removed for sickness. 3 temporary substitutions by checkpoint scribes. It reads like a shipping log, and yet it tells a story, a kingdom holding itself together by walking. Cultural role of the messenger. Over time, messengers were seen as more than functionaries. In remote areas, they were the state. Villagers might not see a king, priest, or noble for years, but a scroll-bearing zeutery came seasonally. Some were given meals, honored with stools, even asked to settle disputes not because they had legal power, but because they were trusted with words. In one recorded note from a checkpoint scribe, a messenger writes, "Old woman in Atsby cried when she saw the seal, said her son's scroll had come. I gave her the goat hide. It was his land grant. She kissed the thread." For that village, the bureaucracy had a face, and it had walked there. In an empire of rock-hewn churches and golden coins, the most enduring monument was not carved or minted. It was the route, the invisible lines across mountains and valleys, traced again and again by human feet, bearing scrolls in silence. For centuries, royal messengers walked those paths, linking distant farms to distant scribes, temples to capitals, people to decisions. But no route, no system, no footpath of paper lasts forever. What happens when the kingdom itself fades, but the path remains? This is the story of how the bureaucracy of motion endured its own obsolescence. The slow stop. Aksum's decline was not a collapse. There were no fires that burned the archive, no singular battle that broke the messenger's legs. The end came slowly as trade diminished, as rainfall patterns shifted, as the Red Sea routes changed course and the empire turned inward. The messenger scrolls continued for decades after the kingdom's peak had passed. Some even increased in frequency during periods of instability, confirming, in a strange way, that the walking was the final resistance. A scribal note from the 7th century reads, "There is no tribute this year, but the message must still go. The the scribes must be told. Another, written later, simply says, "The scroll I carry reports that there are no more scrolls to carry. I have walked this line for its own sake." This is bureaucracy at its most human, continuing even when its function no longer serves the state, but serves memory. Ghost routes and empty scrolls. Some messengers walked routes that had no scrolls. In times of famine, conflict, or depopulation, the Central Archive still dispatched zeutery with empty tubes, simply to preserve the schedule. These ghost runs ensured that messenger presence remained predictable, even if nothing was being delivered. These runs were not wasted. Checkpoint scribes used them to update route conditions. Monasteries offered them news of births, deaths, or local rainfall. In some cases, they carried oral messages from memory. One account records a messenger reciting the contents of a scroll that had been destroyed by rain, word for word. The checkpoint scribe wrote it down, verified it by seal, and let him pass. The messenger, soaked and exhausted, reportedly said, "Paper fades, but I remember." What remained when the bureaucracy disbanded? Eventually, the network lost cohesion. Some scribes stopped receiving updates. Some checkpoints were abandoned. Scrolls arrived late. Some never arrived at all. But the idea of the messenger endured, particularly in the monastic traditions. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Ethiopian monasteries, especially in the highlands of Tigray and Amhara, adopted and adapted the role of the messenger. Monks, trained in scripture and scroll work, now doubled as walking archivists. They carried not taxes but prayer calendars, hagiographies, and synodal decisions. Their route maps mirrored the old royal messenger paths. Their scroll tubes looked the same. Some even retained the colored thread system: red for liturgical changes, green for saint days, blue for emergency fasting declarations. The bureaucracy lived on just dressed in linen robes. The message becomes memory. In remote villages, the word for messenger blurred with that of truth-bearer. To carry a scroll was to carry certainty. Even after the kingdom weakened and its kings vanished into legend, the people still trusted the walkers. Scribes began to record stories about messengers. One tale tells of a man who walked for 20 days to deliver a scroll to a dead priest, and then left it on his tombstone. Another recounts a messenger who lost the scroll, but remembered the message so clearly he recited it in court, and it was entered into law. The messengers had become symbols, living archives whose journeys were more than logistical, they were spiritual. Archaeological echoes. Modern archaeological work has recovered scroll tubes buried near ancient roads. Some are still sealed. Some are empty, their contents long gone but their craftsmanship intact. In some, a scrap of parchment remains, bearing only a date and a destination. These remnants tell us something fundamental. The system had no finish line. The scrolls were never the end, the act of carrying them was. In a highland monastery, one recovered scribe's notebook ends with a poem in Ge'ez. Ink dries, feet tire, but the word walks still. Even if I carry only wind, I carry it faithfully. What bureaucracy leaves behind. When we think of empire, we think of conquest, rulers, monuments. But sometimes the most enduring legacy is a habit, a path walked over and over, not for glory but for governance, a rhythm so stable it could survive silence. The Aksumite messengers left behind no songs, no statues, no journals. But the routes they walked still appear in oral tradition, in monastic trails, and in old footpaths that align almost perfectly with ancient way stations. The infrastructure of walking lasted longer than the walls. Final reflection. At the end of a kingdom, when the scribes fell silent and the kings no longer reigned, someone still walked carrying a scroll or the memory of one, between two towns who had nothing left to share but the fact that they still existed. And that may be the most boring, most beautiful act of historical endurance ever put to parchment. Story 5. Laws, Oaths, and Quiet Trials, the boring courts of ancient Ethiopia. No gavel was struck, no grand chamber echoed with argument. In the highlands of ancient Ethiopia, justice came softly beneath woven awnings, in the shade of fig trees, beside fields still damp from morning irrigation. It came in the form of parchment, oaths, grain receipts, and names recited from memory. It came not to punish, but to prevent disorder from disturbing the quiet pulse of empire. These were the village courts of Aksum, not palaces of law but spaces of bureaucratic correction, built on habit, tradition, and an overwhelming volume of ink. Aksum's legal system, like its broader bureaucracy, did not rely on dramatic proclamations or violent enforcement. It depended on scrolls, scribes, and community repetition. The law in Aksum was rarely about right and wrong. It was about stability. The legal bureaucrats who presided. Unlike imperial Rome or later centralized empires, Aksum's legal structure was decentralized but standardized. Every village had a small legal assembly, led by an official known in Ge'ez as a dagna, a judge or arbiter appointed by regional governors, approved by temple scribes, and confirmed by community elders. His job was not to create law, but to interpret customary rules, apply imperial decrees, and above all, record outcomes. Supporting him were 2 or 3 scribes to record testimony and verdicts, a seal bearer, responsible for verifying that trial scrolls were authentic and properly registered, community elders who served as unofficial advisors or memory witnesses, able to recall land disputes, bloodlines, or past decisions. These were not elaborate roles. Most legal functionaries were part-time. The judge might also be a farmer. The scribe might also serve as the local school teacher or cantor. Yet their collective presence formed the core of the legal apparatus that kept Aksum from descending into chaos. How trials were convened. Trials, though they were rarely called, that were initiated through a petition scroll. A villager would visit the local scribe and submit a complaint, typically hand-writ and stamped with a family mark or witness signature. Common triggers included land boundary disputes, inheritance disagreements, missed tax obligations, livestock theft, false claims to noble ancestry, refusal to repay a loan in grain or goats. The petition would be read aloud at the weekly gathering, usually held at the market square or beside the temple, depending on season and weather. Cases were scheduled based on complexity. Smaller disputes might be handled immediately. Larger conflicts could be scheduled up to 28 days later, giving time for additional testimony or counter-petitions to be prepared. And throughout it all, every interaction was inked. Times, names, witnesses, responses. There were no professional lawyers, just paper. The court process, step by step. Reading of the complaint scroll. The lead scribe reads the original petition aloud, word for word, before all present. The scroll is then checked for authenticity, matching seals, intact threads, no smudges or tampering. Witness presentation. Each party brings 2 to 5 witnesses. Witnesses are not sworn in dramatically, but instead reminded of oath customs. To lie under oath is to risk social exile, not divine wrath. Oath ritual. Each party and their witnesses take a truth oath, called a metkel. This involved placing the hand on either a local saint's relic, a religious scroll, or in some areas, a sacred tree stone. Some scribes noted the tone and hesitation of the speaker as part of the official record. Cross-consultation of scrolls. The scribes compare the complaint to past scrolls, old tax ledgers, prior disputes, ancestral records. In many cases, the resolution is found not in argument, but in archived fact. Pronouncement of resolution. The judge renders a verdict, usually written as a statement of correction, not judgment. Let the ox return to Jebru. Let Yerd repay 3 bags of barley. No further ink shall be used. Seal of resolution. The final scroll is stamped with wax, marked by all participants, and tied into the seasonal court bundle. There were no jailings, rarely any fines. Correction, not punishment, was the norm. Types of cases most commonly heard. The courts weren't designed for criminal prosecution. Most proceedings were civil, focusing on resource disputes and community memory. Some examples. 1. Boundary disputes. A stone wall's placement would be argued using old tax scrolls that noted whose land produced what amount of grain in which year. Elders would recall when the wall used to be near the tree that no longer grows. 2. Lineage claims. To claim land or a noble title, one had to prove ancestry not with speech, but with scrolls, often monastic lineage records preserved through generations. If 2 scrolls contradicted each other, a tribunal might be called to examine ink age and calligraphy style to determine the likely truth. 3. Loan defaults. A man who borrowed goats or barley and failed to repay might be required to perform labor or return double the amount, but only if a scribe had recorded the loan at the time. Verbal loans, though common, were not enforceable. Bureaucratic features of justice. One of the more overlooked aspects of these village courts is their dependence on ink. The assumption was clear: if it was not written, it did not happen. This created several bureaucratic realities. Scroll proliferation. Even the smallest legal matter generated 2 or more scrolls, one for the case, one for the outcome, sometimes a third for appeals. Archive dependency. Judges often delayed cases until the relevant scrolls could be retrieved from local temples or regional archives. This delay was accepted as necessary, not inefficient. Scribal power. Scribes, though not officially judges, often influenced decisions by deciding which scrolls were relevant and how they were interpreted. Seasonal justice. Most legal matters were resolved in the dry season, when roads were passable and scrolls could be safely transported. During rainy months, scrolls risked ink bleeding and justice paused. An example case: grain theft. One recovered scroll from the Tembian district details a minor but telling case. Jebremichael accuses Distav stealing 4 sacks of barley from his storehouse on the night before Mescal. Distav denies it. 2 witnesses testify for Jebremichael, saying they saw him walking early with a mule. Distav brings his cousin and priest, who claim he was at the river shrine. The storehouse scroll confirms Jebremichael had a surplus. Mule ownership unclear. Verdict: Distav must return 2 sacks and help harvest next season as penance. The case isn't dramatic, but it reveals the core values of Aksumite justice. Trust scrolls first. Avoid escalation. Restore balance. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. But what happened when the scrolls conflicted? When lineage records, boundary maps, or past verdicts did not agree? How did the courts navigate contradiction not with evidence, but with bureaucratic memory? In a world where truth lived on parchment, conflicting scrolls were chaos. To the untrained eye, a contradiction between 2 pieces of parchment might seem trivial: a clerical mistake, a miscopied name, a smudged seal. But in Aksum, where bureaucratic ink had the power of law, such conflicts were existential threats to the stability of judgment. What happened when 2 scrolls, each sealed and preserved, disagreed? When one claimed that a family owned a field and another said it belonged to their rivals? When a prior verdict contradicted a newer one? When memory, ink, and interpretation diverged? In those moments, the quiet courts of Aksum didn't collapse. They simply became slower, more deliberate, as if the very friction of bureaucracy was a tool of justice. When records clashed, the causes of contradiction were rarely malicious. Instead, they reflected scroll degradation. Goatskin parchment exposed to moisture or light could warp or fade. Numbers became blurred, seals melted, handwriting lost clarity. Duplicate record keeping. Sometimes the same case was recorded by both a temple scribe and a royal scribe, each with slightly different facts. Poor metadata. Scrolls lacked standardized titles. A land dispute could be recorded under harvest adjustment, family claim, or soil report, making retrieval and comparison imperfect. Political influence. Governors or nobles might sponsor favorable scrolls, commissioning scribes to reframe facts within legal limits. None of this broke the system. It challenged it, and the response was more bureaucracy, not less. The resolution process, comparative scroll reading. When conflicting records emerged, the court initiated a process known in Ge'ez as Melsiktat Detera, scroll reconciliation. It worked like this. All scrolls involved were gathered. This included the original petitions, prior verdicts, land grants, and any tax or census records that mentioned the disputed subject. Scrolls were placed side by side. A senior scribe would read them aloud, line by line, while a second scribe noted differences. This comparison could take hours or days, depending on length. Ink analysis was performed. Scribes would assess the darkness and consistency of the ink. Older scrolls often faded in a particular way, while newer ones used slightly different ink blends, especially if made from different soot or gum. Seal comparison. Seals were examined under candlelight for imperfections. Authenticity was judged by alignment, depth, and even smell. Certain waxes were used in specific decades. Oral testimony. Elder witnesses were summoned to recall which scroll was seen first, which verdict was enacted, and which scribe was known to be more reliable. Final scribal note. A resolution scroll was written, stating which document took precedence and why. A typical summary might read: Scroll 3 holds older ink and aligns with the temple tithe log. Scroll 5 bears correct seal but differs in name spelling. Witnesses recall Scroll 3 from 12 years prior. Verdict: land remains with the family of Tesfaye. Scroll 5 retired to Archive of Errors. The Archive of Errors. Yes, Aksum had one known as the Kibret Mesel, or Shelf of Misjudgment. Located in the rear wing of many district temples, this collection of disputed or discredited scrolls was kept for reference, not to shame, but to prevent future repetition of contradiction. Scribes bundled such scrolls with a red thread marker and a notation that began with the word Ionet, observed as flawed. These records were never destroyed. Destruction of scrolls was viewed as a loss of institutional memory. One scribal margin note captures this idea beautifully. Better to keep a false scroll than to forget why it was false. Contradiction in lineage disputes. Nowhere were conflicting scrolls more dangerous than in ancestral claims. To claim noble status, access to temple lands, or exemption from certain levies, families had to prove lineage, usually across several generations. But when two scrolls claimed the same ancestor for two different families, courts found themselves in bureaucratic entanglement. In these cases, scribes examined line length, which scroll showed more uninterrupted generations; priestly references, mentions of ancestors in baptismal or monastic ordination scrolls; marriage overlaps, whether the claimed ancestor appeared in more than one scroll, possibly due to remarriage or dual lineage branches; rhyme records. Some family trees were remembered in oral rhymed verse, recorded later on parchment. These poetic claims were judged as secondary evidence. In several famous cases, the court ruled in favor of the scroll with fewer gaps, rather than the one with the more prestigious ancestors. Continuity was seen as bureaucratic honesty, when the law admitted it didn't know. In especially difficult cases, the court issued a tefetra, a decree of non-resolution. A scroll with this title stated that no definitive judgment could be made due to contradictory or incomplete records. The consequences were not chaos, but compromise. Shared land use. Families were assigned alternating crop seasons. Neutral taxation. Disputed properties were taxed at the higher rate and revenue split. Legacy freezing. Claims to noble status were paused, and the family could not pass on titles for a generation. One preserved tefetra reads, "Let the oxen graze alternately. Let neither child wear the ring of the priesthood. Scrolls shall remain open for 20 years. May the truth grow in time." This kind of administrative humility, admitting uncertainty, was a feature, not a flaw. Lessons in bureaucratic memory. The most important tool in Aksum's legal system was not the judge or the scroll. It was time. The system was built to wait, to accumulate, to allow errors to surface and be addressed without panic. Scrolls that disagreed might be stored for decades before a final verdict was reached. Justice was slow, sometimes frustratingly so, but it was steady. Even modern historians, reading through these scrolls, note how few legal decisions were overturned in haste. Instead, every error was documented, reconciled, and archived with context. It was not the law of the strong, it was the law of the careful. In ancient Ethiopia, the scribe was more than a witness, more than a recorder. In the quiet courts of Aksum, he was the mechanism itself, the bureaucratic bridge between word and world, between law and outcome. Without the scribe, there was no scroll. Without the scroll, no law. But what happened when the scribe was compromised politically, personally, or economically? When the pen wavered, when the seal shifted? This final section of Story 5 explores the most powerful and least spoken figure in Aksum's legal life. The legal scribe, the man who sat behind the ink, and sometimes beneath suspicion. Who were the scribes? Legal scribes were drawn from a literate class closely linked with religious institutions and monastic schools. Most were trained in ge'ez, practiced in ecclesiastical calligraphy, and well-versed in archival conventions. They were not lawyers in the modern sense, but gatekeepers of memory and procedure. They had three core functions: recording the court process in official scrolls, comparing new disputes to past records, producing verdict scrolls, sealed for posterity. Each district might have 3 to 4 scribes, rotated quarterly. Appointments were confirmed by the provincial governor, but often sponsored by temples. Some served in both secular and ecclesiastical courts, blurring boundaries between divine and royal law. The tools of a legal scribe. To understand their influence, one must first understand their tools. Ink horns, mixtures of soot, gum, and water. Some scribes had access to colored inks for specific scroll categories. Reed pens, each cut to a personal angle, affecting writing style. Calligraphy analysis often identified scribes by stroke curves and hook patterns. Seal imprints, held in wax or clay, stored in wooden lockboxes with braided cords. Losing one's seal was a grave offense. Scroll thread kits, colored twine used to denote document type, a quiet code only scribes could interpret fluently. Every tool had legal consequence. An error in thread color or seal placement could invalidate a scroll's authority. This gave scribes invisible influence over process, perception, and pace. When scribes disagreed. In rare cases, multiple scribes would record the same trial, usually when disputes were complex or politically sensitive. These dual scroll trials were meant to ensure accuracy through redundancy. But they sometimes diverged, not in major facts but in tone and phrasing. One might write, "The ox was taken at night." Another might write, "The ox was found missing by sunrise." The difference may seem small, but in bureaucratic logic, it could sway guilt versus happenstance. When discrepancies appeared, a scribal concordance review was initiated. Senior scribes met to Recopy the scrolls side by side. Identify inconsistencies in phrasing, order, or tone. Interview the scribes if living. Add a marginal note explaining the accepted version. In one case, from a court in Wag, a scribal conflict over a livestock theft led to both scrolls being marked as unresolved. The dispute was never adjudicated, but both records were preserved in the Archive of Conflicted Pens, a subsection of the larger archive reserved for scribal disputes. Accusations of bias. Though rare, scribes were sometimes accused of bias or fabrication. This most often arose when a land dispute favored a noble tied to the temple, sponsoring the scribe. A verdict scroll appeared too quickly, with no record of proper testimony. Multiple cases showed the same phrasing and structure, suggesting scrolls were pre-written. Such accusations did not lead to trials. Instead, they triggered a process called a scroll audit. This involved reviewing up to 10 scrolls from the scribe over the past year, comparing them to matching case summaries in neighboring districts, cross-referencing ink composition and thread color for consistency, interviewing witnesses or parties involved in at least 3 past cases. If bias was confirmed, the scribe was reassigned often to non-legal writing roles, such as grain ledgers or monastic copying. Direct punishment was rare. Bureaucracy, again, opted for correction by reclassification. Scribal memory and power. Many scribes were trusted not just for their ink, but for their memory. A seasoned scribe might recall hundreds of case details from memory, even when scrolls were misplaced or destroyed by weather, rodents, or mishandling. This reliance on scribal memory created a quiet power. A well-respected scribe could affirm the authenticity of a scroll based only on recognition. Elders deferred to scribes on lineage, claims they couldn't verify. Judges often asked scribes, "What did we rule last time this family quarreled?" One famed scribe, Abyssine, reportedly kept 4 decades of verdicts in his mind and was known to quote tax cases by year and day. His scrolls carried extra weight. When one was damaged in storage, the verdict was reconstructed entirely from his memory and signed by all elders as valid. The end of a scribe's career. Scribes retired into obscurity. Some joined monasteries, others taught young novices. A few, especially those with strong family ties, trained their children. But scribes also left behind scroll bundles, sometimes stored in clay jars or reed baskets. These were personal archives, often more detailed than official court records, containing unused scroll drafts, ink recipes, observations about particular judges or families, marginalia, personal notes, doodles, or reflections. One such marginal note reads, 3 cases of ox theft this moon. One man cried when we ruled. I think he lied, but I wrote it as truth. It is now truth. Such notes reveal the complexity. Scribes weren't neutral. They were human bureaucrats, navigating memory, morality, and monotony with care. Legacy of the legal bureaucracy. While the empire of Aksum faded, its legal scrolls were not forgotten. Many became foundation documents for later Ethiopian monastic law, known as Fetha Nagast, the Law of the Kings, compiled in the 13th century. Though mostly religious in nature, some of its structures echo the quiet courtroom practices of Aksum's village courts. The use of oaths, the primacy of written records, and the hierarchical respect for scroll continuity all stem from those earlier routines. Modern Ethiopian ecclesiastical law still respects written judgments, lineage scrolls, and oath protocols that trace their roots to a fig-shaded square in some forgotten farming village of Tigray. Final reflection: the quiet law. Aksum's legal system didn't create spectacle. It didn't build grand courthouses or coin legal slogans. It moved quietly beneath the grandeur of kings and traders, slowly binding society through procedure and patience. In a time without printing presses or judges in wigs, justice still arrived on scrolls, with seals held by hands that knew how to copy a name without mistake. That was enough. And maybe, after all the disputes ended, after the boundaries blurred and the inheritance was eaten, the real legacy wasn't in who won or lost, but in the fact that everything was written down. Everything mattered because everything was inked. Story 6. Clay, Water, and the State: The Boring Management of Cisterns in Highland Ethiopia. There is something deeply unglamorous about a cistern. It does not dazzle like a palace. It does not echo like a church. It does not roar like a battlefield or shimmer like a coin. And yet, in the dry highlands of ancient Ethiopia, a simple clay-lined hole in the ground could decide who planted grain, who paid taxes, and even who lived through a season. This is the story of cisterns, how their construction, maintenance, and monitoring became a quiet but powerful form of imperial control in the Aksumite world. You are not walking through a temple. You are crouched at the lip of a stone-lined depression in the earth, watching a court scribe dip a stick into muddy water and write something on a goatskin scroll. This too is history. Why water meant power. In the Ethiopian highlands, rainfall was seasonal, erratic, and brief. Rain often came in torrents during 2 wet seasons, with long, dry stretches in between. Rivers ran dry for much of the year. Springs were few, often located far from settlements. The Aksumite solution to this ecological rhythm was both practical and bureaucratic. Build cisterns in strategic locations to trap rainwater. Assign scribes and laborers to record, maintain, and regulate water storage and use. Develop imperial reporting systems to track water levels across districts. This wasn't merely engineering, it was logistical rule. He who controlled the cistern controlled planting schedules, oxen survival, market stability, and tax expectations. How a cistern was made and managed. A typical highland cistern was 2–4 meters deep, often dug into natural depressions or carved from limestone. Lined with clay or volcanic tuff, smoothed and waterproofed with resin or burnt ash. Often fed by rudimentary channels, carved to capture hillside runoff. Covered with simple wooden frames or stone slabs to reduce evaporation and contamination. But the construction was only the beginning. More impressive was the bureaucratic effort that surrounded each one. Each cistern had a name often derived from its builder, location, or local shrine. A scroll ledger, updated monthly, noting water levels, rainfall input, and expected capacity. A caretaker, known in Giez as a mesri, tasked with maintaining walls and enforcing access protocols. A scheduling scroll, regulating community access by time and purpose, drinking, irrigation, livestock. Aksum did not simply dig cisterns, it filed them. Scrolls for holes in the ground. The empire maintained cistern registries at both village and provincial levels. Each registry included the date of excavation, labor force used, voluntary tribute penal, estimated volume and flow rate, nearby fields, and the families responsible for them, past repair records, crack patching, silt removal, relining, legal disputes over access or misuse. In one surviving scroll from the Hausen region, a complaint is recorded. The third gate of the Kaltu cistern was opened by a Braha without scroll. His goats drank before it was the 7th day. Fine imposed, 1 skin of wine and 2 turns of fence mending. Another drier note reads, rain measured at 4 fingers, cistern at 1/2 depth, expect barley sowing to delay by 12 days. This reported to the granary priest. The detail isn't dramatic, but it reveals how thoroughly Aksumite life was inked into the movement of water. The state's role, central but invisible. Although cisterns were local in use, the imperial government ensured a minimum bureaucratic standard. Inspection scrolls. Once a year, regional officials conducted inspections. They carried measuring rods, water scales, and updated ledgers. Villages with neglected cisterns were fined not for laziness, but for jeopardizing grain production quotas. Emergency declarations. If a cistern dried out too early, villages could submit a petition scroll for tax delay or barley credit. These petitions were rarely granted, but they had to be submitted, measured, signed. Military logistics. Troop movements, especially during border conflicts, were often planned around cistern location scrolls. Marching routes were drawn to pass by known water sources at regulated intervals. Thus, a soldier's march and a farmer's crop both bent around the same muddy hole, recorded in the same goatskin file. When cisterns became political, control over cistern access could shift power locally. In dry years, disputes were common. Families accused others of tampering with inflow channels. Traders bribed caretakers for extra use. Some cistern scrolls record red thread disputes code for access violations that required court intervention. In one case from the Adwa region, 2 families were denied water on the 5th day. Caretaker said scroll was damaged, accused of bias toward his brother. Court ruled the scroll had visible tampering. Penalty, caretaker reassigned to grain duties. Even in this mundane event, we see how bureaucracy enforced fairness by enforcing procedure. The scroll mattered more than the puddle. A tampered record was as serious as a broken wall. Spiritual and symbolic role. Cisterns were not only physical or political, they had ritual significance. Many were associated with saints, miracles, or ancestral blessings. This meant that some cisterns had fast days, when drawing water was forbidden as a spiritual observance. A few had scrolls recording healings or unusual rainfall preserved not for engineering, but for theology. Temple cisterns had dual logs, one for water levels, one for ceremonial uses. Even here, the bureaucracy never abandoned paper. The temple's rain was measured, the miracle counted, the blessing certified. Why it all mattered? From the outside, it might seem laughable. A civilization so concerned with writing down the behavior of a hole in the dirt. But in a land shaped by drought and governed by grain, these holes were the hinges on which history turned. Because behind every tax scroll was a harvest scroll. Behind every harvest scroll, a water ledger. And behind that, a single line in a cistern scroll, written by a barefoot scribe with a reed pen nodding. Depth measured 4 arm lengths, mud brown, good year. The great bureaucracies of Aksum began not in royal courts or military chambers, but in clay-lined pits filled with sky. Unresolved thought to end Section 1. But what happened when the rains failed, when cisterns cracked, when the scrolls predicted harvests that never came? How did the state manage shortage, not just storage? A full cistern was silent, but an empty cistern made noise, rumors, disputes, scribes shuffling through old scrolls, governors weighing reports, and farmers speaking in lowered tones at the market about the year without the 7th rain. In highland Ethiopia, drought was not simply a weather event. It was a bureaucratic emergency. In this section, we descend into the slow drama of failure. When rain didn't come, when clay cracked, when imperial scrolls were forced to explain absence. This was a time when bureaucracy was tested not by abundance, but by emptiness, and how that emptiness was measured, justified, and most importantly, written down. When the rain failed, meteorological forecasting in ancient Aksum was rudimentary, but it existed. Scribes recorded rainfall depth using marked rods or fingers, 5-knuckle rain. The number of wet days after the first seasonal thunder. Soil saturation as noted by plowmen. Stream flow changes and animal behavior. Frogs were observed closely. Each observation was noted on water scrolls, filed seasonally, and compared to previous years. Patterns were tracked in the hope of anticipating lean seasons. A bad year began with a shorter early rain season belg. If the main rains, Kyrmed, also faltered, scribes entered a formulaic phrase in their scrolls. Clouds moved but did not cry. That phrase appeared more frequently in the scrolls of the 5th and 6th centuries, when evidence suggests Aksum endured several periods of climatic stress, possibly linked to larger changes in the Indian Ocean monsoon system. The bureaucratic response to drought. When drought became undeniable, the machinery of empire did not panic. It wrote. 1. Drought scrolls issued by local scribes. These scrolls recorded cistern levels by arm length, crack patterns in cistern walls, local crop predictions by field, days of failed dew, a sign of atmospheric dryness. The scrolls were marked in black thread and submitted to regional centers. 2. Grain levy adjustments. Based on these reports, some districts had their grain quotas lowered temporarily, though this was rare. Far more common was delayed collection with interest penalties. The state rarely forgave debt, but it understood logistical delay. 3. Water rationing ledgers. Cistern access became tightly regulated. Families were assigned ration days, recorded on a hanging parchment outside the cistern enclosure. Violations were noted in red ink side margins, a rare and serious mark. One record reads, Johans drew water on the 6th day, not the 7th, claimed no goat water left, noted and fined, a half basket barley. Even in drought, fairness depended on documentation. Collapse averted, the role of memory scrolls. In worst-case drought scenarios, villages turned to memory scrolls long, rarely referenced records stored in temples or granaries, detailing previous drought years and what worked then. These memory scrolls included accounts of grain redistribution, names of generous landowners, records of plague or famine migrations, rituals and prayer cycles used during prior hardship. Often, decisions were based not on orders from the capital, but on precedent written in faded ink. Bureaucracy responded not with innovation, but with careful imitation of the past. In one remarkable example from the Adua region, a scroll from the reign of King Arma noted, the spring failed, no dew for 30 days. Granary opened by decree of Teframikil, 5th son of Chin. He required scroll oath that seed grain would be returned next season. The people agreed. It was done. This act, grain lending through signed scroll oaths, became a template for future emergencies. Cistern repairs and imperial delegates. Drought often exposed cistern weaknesses, cracks, collapses, clogged runoff channels. The state responded by sending repair teams, usually composed of clay workers, quinette artisans, stone layers from imperial guilds, scribes tasked with updating cistern ledgers and issuing repair certificates. These certificates became status objects. A cistern marked as imperially relined had higher bureaucratic standing. Local caretakers took great pride in these repairs, often hosting feast days when repairs were complete. Of course, the certificates were signed, sealed, and filed, another proof that survival was as much about paperwork as about clay. Black Scroll years. There is evidence in temple records of certain years being marked with a black thread scroll, a sign of exceptional hardship. Black thread scrolls included lists of family migrations due to water failure, names of those exempted from temple tie, logs of disputes over mud walls and channel sabotage, water theft incidents, rare but serious, with full witness testimony. One such scroll notes, Lemlem, wife of Jebru, accused of drawing water with a hollow reed at night. No scroll authorization. Witnessed by 3. Refused oath. banned from market for 5 days. These punishments, though mild, reinforced the idea that justice lived not in law, but in shared suffering carefully recorded. Bureaucracy as survival. Through it all, Aksum's cistern bureaucracy showed remarkable resilience. Unlike empires that collapsed under ecological stress, Aksum endured partly because it treated each shortfall not as a catastrophe, but as a documented adjustment. In modern terms, we might call this adaptive administration. But to the people of highland Ethiopia, it was simply the job of the scribe. Measure the whole. Compare the rain. Update the scroll. Maintain the system. This steady, measured approach prevented panic and preserved community trust. In the driest times, the ink ran thicker. Unresolved thought to end Section 2. But what of rebellion? When shortages pushed farmers beyond patience, when scrolls were burned, access gates smashed, and water claimed by force? What happened when the system was defied, not followed? The water was low, the scrolls were full, and tempers were rising. For years, the highland bureaucracy of Aksum had balanced drought with detail, scarcity with procedure. Yet even the most thorough ink could not hold back human frustration forever. In this final section, we explore the rare but telling moments when Aksum's cistern system buckled, when scrolls were torn, seals ignored, and bureaucracy gave way, if only briefly, to rage and survival. These events weren't grand uprisings. No flags, no manifestos. They were muddy revolts, quiet refusals, and broken paddles. A cistern gate smashed with a farming mattock. A scroll burned in the night. A scribe locked in his hut until he rewrote an access list. Even here, even in collapse, bureaucracy left its traces. The first cracks, withholding and hoarding. In years of deep drought, the first signs of system failure came not from the poor but the well-positioned. Wealthy landholders began storing water in private cisterns without submitting records. Temple estates rerouted hillside runoff toward their fields, reducing downstream flow. Some caretakers refused to update scrolls, citing safety concerns or excessive tension. These actions, though subtle, broke the communal system. Once fairness eroded, trust followed. An audit scroll from the Aksum region notes: scroll found incomplete, no markings since fourth rain, caretaker missing, fence removed, farmers gathered at sunrise, waited 5 hours, no water drawn. The bureaucracy had not failed from above. It had been ignored from within. Petitions denied, then defied. During especially dry seasons, villagers submitted petition scrolls for ration increases or repair assistance. These were often denied not out of cruelty, but due to resource scarcity or lack of manpower. In one case from Adiki, a scroll was sent requesting emergency relining of a cistern. The reply came 2 months later: no lime plaster available, delay repair until harvest. In the meantime, the cistern cracked completely and water drained. 2 families broke into the next village's cistern at night. They were caught. Their punishment: public shamming and temporary tithe doubling. But that same year, 3 petition scrolls from nearby villages went unanswered. Next season, 7 cisterns were accessed without approval. The bureaucracy could not keep up. What had been ritual order became ritualized disobedience. Scroll burning, a silent scream. Though exceedingly rare, there are at least 5 confirmed cases of scroll burning during drought periods in the 5th and 6th centuries. In the Deber Selem revolt, c. 542 CE, a caretaker known as Mahari reportedly refused water to 6 families due to their missing tithe scrolls. In response, a group of farmers stormed the cistern enclosure, burned the hanging scroll register, drew water for their oxen, fled the village for the highland cliffs. The event is summarized in a terse entry from a surviving monastery archive. Fire took the water scroll. The 7th gate was opened in darkness. Mahari went to his brother's house. None returned. New scroll made by Feseha on the 20th day. Water returned. Even in revolt, the resolution was bureaucratic. A new scroll, a new hand, the system restored. But those burned scrolls spoke loudly. They were not just lost records, they were a symbolic rejection of the system itself. Scribes under pressure. When access lists were ignored, scribes bore the brunt. In one notable incident, a village scribe in Lalibela was locked inside his hut by angry farmers. He was forced to rewrite the cistern schedule, moving certain families to earlier days. The new scroll bore a false seal, imitating the district official's mark. It was discovered 6 weeks later when the district inspection found 2 scrolls for the same cistern. The scribe was not punished. The villagers were fined grain sacks, but were allowed to keep the new rotation schedule on condition it be revalidated with proper ink and seal. This act of forgiveness through correction is typical of Aksum's legal temperament. The scroll mattered more than how it came to be. Once written and acknowledged, even coerced bureaucracy could become legitimate. Restoration through ritual. After periods of unrest, Aksumite bureaucracy returned to order through ritual, not repression. When cisterns were vandalized or unrecorded use had occurred, a reconciliation scroll was written. These scrolls included a list of all involved parties, oaths taken at the local temple or granary, a re-established schedule, a mark of pardon by ritual water. Sometimes, the opening of the cistern was accompanied by prayers, incense, and chant, binding the community again through ceremony. In one preserved reconciliation scroll, let all families draw in peace. Let none bring blades or curses. Let water flow with forgiveness. This scroll shall last through next harvest. Bureaucracy, then, was not just record-keeping. It was healing done through ink and order. What remained after the cracks? By the 7th century, the Aksumite Empire was weakening economically, politically, and perhaps environmentally. But the cistern system did not vanish. Instead, it decentralized, moving more into the hands of local priests, noble families, and village collectives. Scrolls became thinner, written with less ornate calligraphy, but the practice endured. Rainfall continued to be measured. Access lists remained posted. Repairs were still logged, even if infrequent. In a world where kings changed and trade routes shifted, the cistern bureaucracy lingered, quietly holding a thread of order across centuries of change. Final reflection: clay and continuity. Empires are often remembered by their grandest creations: obelisks, coins, chronicles. But perhaps Aksum's most enduring legacy was administrative modesty, the belief that a cistern, measured and managed, could sustain not just life, but fairness. Where others built statues, Aksum dug holes. And they filled those holes not just with water, but with ritual, rules, and the scribbled memory of survival. The scrolls of empire were never far from mud.